Close the blinds. I was 10 years old. Every summer for the 9 years prior, I had spent at least 1 week at my grandmother's house in Maryland. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, a stark contrast to my South Florida home, where I barely knew the neighbors who were one house away. My grandmother could tell me the names of her neighbors, their kids, and what grades they were in. They all knew and loved her. They looked after her. On this summer day, we were playing cards, as we often did, at her wooden dining room table. She lived in a red brick house that had a crawl space under it, so it was slightly elevated off the ground. One of the things I loved most about her being at her house was the way that she would wake up every morning and open all the blinds with the natural lights in. As soon as the sun would set, she would close the blinds, and we would retreat into the comfort of the lamp-lit, green shag rugged living room to watch the evening news. This day, however, we started playing cards while the sun was still up, and being wrapped up in the game, until well after the sun had set. The phone rang, interrupting our focus. I jumped up, excited to answer. "Hello?" I didn't recognize the voice on the other line. All I could identify was the urgency in their pitch. "Can I speak with Mrs. C, please?" "Yeah, hold on, Grandma, it's for you." Who else would have been for? She was the only one who had lived in that house for the last 12 years, since my grandpa had passed away. I sat at the kitchen table closer to the pantry, where she kept her phone, and watched her with eager, curious eyes. I waited for her to tell me who was on the line, or a hint in the conversation that might give it away. She didn't tell me. In fact, the only thing she said before she hung up the phone was, "Oh my, okay, thank you." What could this be about? "Granny, who was that?" She wasn't paying attention to me. I wasn't even in the room for her anymore. "Grandma, who was it? What's wrong? What's going on?" The urgency had transferred from the caller, through my voice and into her eyes. Her face twisted as she picked the phone up this time to call the police. I grew worried, scared. The world felt like it was dissolving around me, but I didn't know how or why. I didn't even know it was the police she was calling. I just had to listen to her half of the conversation to try and figure out who she was calling and why. "Hi, yes. Can you send someone to my house at Elmbrook Drive? I have reason to believe there's a trespasser on my property." I strained to hear the response of the person on the other line, but all I could hear was my grandma's now labored breathing. "Okay, thank you." Again, she hung up the phone. By this time, I had started crying, feeling panicked. Again, my questions went unanswered as she picked up the phone to call her next-door neighbor. "Hi, sorry to bother you, it's Ola. Can you come over? Please bring your gun." She looked up and saw me as she closed the door. I could no longer hear what she was saying. "A gun? Did she say gun?" Things were getting real and fast. A minute later, she emerged to address me. "Sweetheart, let's go to the bedroom. I need to meet Mr. R for a minute, and I just want to stay in there until I tell her to come out, okay?" "What's going on, Grandma? Why did you call the police? What's wrong?" It came out in fractured segments as I caught my breath from all the crying. I'll explain everything soon." I sat in the bedroom, looked through the blinds to watch for the neighbor. A weak flashlight appeared in the yard from the left. It bounced up and down with each of his steps. Next to the flashlight, I could see the barrel of a shotgun, something I had only ever seen a handful of times, each one equally terrifying. The light bounced past the front door and beyond the garage, where he faded away from sight. A few painstaking minutes later, he was back at the front door knocking. I heard my grandma let him in, muffled voices back and forth. She came and let me out of the room then. I still had no idea what was happening. My stomach was in my throat, my head pounding from the scared tears I couldn't stop shedding. I sat on the couch as the neighbor explained to my grandma that he would stay with us until the police arrived, but that he believed that we were in the clear. As I looked around, I noticed that the once open blinds had been hastily and hazardly closed. Moments later, the police arrived. Like the neighbor, they walked to the back of the house with their lights and guns in hand. When she spoke to them, I only heard bits and pieces as well. We were playing cards. The neighbors from across the way called on the police, watching us through the window. "Called you, called him." The police explained that the property was clear, but took us outside to show us where the man had left footprints in the mud from the back gate leading up to and away from the window that sat at the end of the dining room table. There had been a man in the window watching us as we played cards. The neighbor to the back and across the soccer field had looked out their window to see the shadowed and hooded figure backlit by the light from our open blinds. He had climbed atop a toolbox that sat below the window to get a clear sight of us. What he was planning, we will never know. He must have been spooked by the phone call, a disruption of our game. I will always be grateful for that neighbor who called, a neighbor that I never met. To the guy in the window, let's not meet again. Weirdo in the window. On the night of this incident, it had started to rain right before I went to bed. My bed was right under the window, so I left the Venetian blinds down and my window open a crack, just enough to hear the rain but not enough to let the water in. I've always loved the rain. Because I live in the desert, rain is a rare treat, so I look forward to lulling off to sleep listening to the soothing pitter-patter. Just as I was starting to nod off, that's when I heard it, the crunching outside of my window. It sounded like the rocks outside shifting beneath the weight of something. Startled, I sat up in bed and peered through the cracks of the window blinds. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see a man's figure craning his head outside my window, as if he was trying to find a crack in my blinds so he could see inside. Shocked at what I was looking at, I sat there frozen in fear, mere inches away from his face behind the window. For half a minute my mind was racing, trying to decide what I should do. All the while he was still bobbing and weaving his head trying to look inside, and then I probably did the stupidest thing possible. I yanked on the pulley to lift the blinds open and asked him what he was doing. He jumped back in surprise, and that is when I was able to actually look at him. He looked like a young man in his early 20s, dressed in a stereotypical burglar's outfit, black clothes with a black beanie. I repeated myself, "What are you doing?" That is when I saw his face twist into a sadistic-looking smile as he leaned closer to the window. I could tell he wasn't scared of me because he didn't run or do anything except give me that creepy-ass leering smile. He actually seemed excited to find a girl, and he moved even closer to the window. Trying not to show fear myself, I casually started yelling for my male roommate, "Hey, Eric!" All the while he just stood there staring, as if he didn't believe I had a man living with me. After yelling to him for several times, Eric finally responded half asleep. "What?" I yelled to him. "There's a guy in my window!" At this, the sick fuck waited for Eric to saunter all the way into my bedroom, put his glasses on, stare at him for a good 10 seconds, and then say, "Bro, I'm calling the cops," before he finally decided to get lost. And then, still smiling, he simply picked up what looked like a black bowling bag and walked off slowly. We stared in silence as he just disappeared into the dark of the alley behind our house, occasionally turning his head to look back at us. I'm convinced you don't dress like a cat burgling ninja with a black bag full of God knows what without being up to something rapey. We then called the cops, and unfortunately they never found him. However, a few days later, I was out walking my dog near my window when I saw something sticking out of the bush right underneath. Not knowing what it was, and without thinking, I reached into the bush and pulled it out. I gasped before dropping it and running back inside. It was a fucking hammer. Why I don't like cabins. I was 11 years old when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Belle, my younger sister, was 8 years old. My dad was a freelance programmer when I was younger. He made great money on his jobs, but because he was so heavily in debt, and my mom was not the most gifted person on balancing a budget, we never had much free money available. This meant that we went on a vacation once every few years, and usually that was to a relative's house. My dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion for a new movie. We were in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it, and came back to grab Mom while he kept watching the movie. Belle took the opportunity to pause the film and take Duchess, our dog, captive because she was scared. They came back about 10 minutes later and announced that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't know what to make of that, but apparently, the client he'd been helping owned a nice cabin by a lake in the mountains and offered to let us lodge there this weekend for a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so Mom went into a panic frenzy of packing, so we didn't see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed to the mountains. It was a 2.5-hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and went exploring in the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a little nook thing you could climb up to that was about head height. It was about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for the three of us to hang in and play games. There were a few dozen board games up there, so we started playing once we decided on the rooms. Mom and Dad got the largest one, Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Belle and I got the last room, which had a queen-size bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed without curtain, and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the room, and there was a closet opposite the bed. It was locked and we couldn't get in. We went to bed at around 11. Belle is a kicker, so I slept by the lamp in case she ended up knocking it over or something like that. I remember lying down, and I must have instantly fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, Belle was gripping my arm and trying to burrow under me. She was squeaking something in fright, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I sat up, looked towards her, and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took several moments to process that, and then I was shooting out of bed and dragging Belle with me. We rushed to our parents, who told us we were imagining things. Mom told us to go back to bed, and if we saw anything else to let them know. I, much to my current annoyance, agreed with them, and went back in the room with Belle. We switched positions because she refused to go back to bed by the window. I told her a story to get her asleep, and promptly conked out after her. I didn't wake up until morning. The next day we went exploring around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we'd spend the day in the town. They had a lot of small shops, and my parents went into every one of them. We ate lunch and dinner in the town, and finally went back to the cabin. Ariel made a joke about something as we neared the cabin, and I remember everybody laughing before my dad suddenly held up his hand to make everyone stop. He took another step towards the cabin and pushed the door open with a single finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't latched, but didn't put the obvious together right away. "Dad?" Ariel shuffled nearer to Belle and me, but Dad gave his head a shake to let her know she needed to be quiet. He went into the cabin and disappeared inside for a minute or two while we stood on the porch. Mom called out his name, and he called back that we could come inside. We did, and found him standing in the middle of the living room and dining room with a frown. He locked the door once we were inside and took Mom to the bedroom for a quick chat. Ariel, having caught on to what was happening, opted to distract Belle and me by suggesting another round of the board game we'd been playing the night before. We hadn't been playing for more than 5 minutes when Mom and Dad came back. Mom went about cleaning the dishes from breakfast while Dad joined our game. We played for a few hours before Dad told us we needed to go to bed. It was only 9 at that point, which made Ariel mad. She was allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights and later on weeknights. Belle and I went on to bed while they argued. We climbed back into the same spots we slept in, Belle by the window, and me by the lamp. I read to Belle for a bit before we drifted off. I woke to Dad rushing into our room. He scooped Belle out of bed and grabbed my leg. He dragged me out the room and into the hall, where I saw Ariel getting similar treatment by Mom. I became aware of a high-pitched whine in the living room and saw our dog sitting at attention by the back door. She was bristled and seemed anxious. Dad didn't put Belle down and didn't let go of my hand. They rushed out of the house and into the van. Dad went back to get our door, and then he burned rubber getting out of the cabin. He drove all the way back home and without talking once. It took a half hour for Duchess to calm down. He told Ariel what happened the next day, but Belle and I didn't find out until years later. He'd woken up that night to what sounded like moaning outside the window in his room. He jumped up and looked to see what was going on, and had found the front door unlocked. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess started to growl the back door, which was ajar. He locked it and got us out of the house. He went back the next day to get our luggage, and found several pairs of footprints outside Belle's and my window. Always keep your doors closed and your blinds shut. I'm new at this, so I'll start it simple. I was around 16 years old when this happened to me, female. It was just me and my dad at our house. And since he was a businessman that traveled frequently, I was left home alone quite often. First of all, I'm going to try and do my best to describe to you the layout of my house so you can better understand my situation. My house is pretty small since just my father, my dog, and me living in it. There's a long hallway full of full-size windows, separating my dad's room and mine. Our dog loved to look out the windows, so we always kept them open enough for her to look out. I'm in the last room at the end of the hallway. In between the two rooms is my bathroom and a spare room. All the rest is irrelevant. Let's get to it. It was around 11 p.m. when the worst night of my life began. My dad was passed out in bed after a long day, and I was mindlessly dancing around my house getting ready for bed. I hopped in my shower, not knowing what was coming ahead. And of course, like a cringe-worthy horror movie, my dog starts aggressively barking up a storm. With my excessive knowledge of how it turns out for the girl in the movies, I go out and explore. I head to my room to throw some clothes on, while my dog is still shitting a brick. Months before, I'm not sure how I managed to break my door handle, but you don't have to twist the knob to open it. All it needs is a small push. Scared shitless, I barely managed to put a shirt on when my dog opened the door. I looked to see her enter my room. While in the midst of barking, that's when I saw it. There's only one window that is vision to the opening of my room, and in the corner of it I saw a face. A face so seemingly sinister that I can still see it years later. It was dark, so I took a second to comprehend what I just saw, but when I finally realized it, I screamed. My dad owns a lot of guns, so when he heard me scream for bloody murder, he ran out with a pistol. He asked me what happened, and I could barely mutter what I saw. He ran outside to see if the man with a terrifying face was still near. We stood out there for a minute scanning the area. A man was casually strolling towards us from the opposite direction, from about 100 yards away. I knew it was him. I got that feeling in my stomach that you can't mistake. It was like he was trying to cover up that he was there by coming from a different direction. That bastard didn't fool me. You better stay the fuck away from my daughter. You see what I have here? You know what this does? Holding up his gun. I could have sworn my dad was going to shoot. The man brushed these threats off easily. Fuck off, old man, he said. My dad and I went back inside. He went back to bed like nothing had happened, but I could not sleep a wink. I kept thinking he was going to come out and hurt me because of the threats to him. We called the cops the next morning, and they came and scooped out our house. He looked around the house trying to calm me down, but I was still pretty shaken up, to be honest. He went to the front yard, and that's when he saw it. In front of the windows in the long hallway, there were small bushes. Nothing much. The cop from outside went to the window and had view of my room, and there it was. If he tried to tell me the news without making me more upset, he failed. There were indents in the dirt right in front of the window. That meant he knew where he needed to look for you, and it seemed as if he had come here more than once because of the broken pieces of bush and the divots in the ground. Turns out he was a nephew of my old neighbor, and he'd been staying there for months. Never arrested, never got in trouble, probably barely got a slap on the wrist, but at least he was gone now. How long had he been watching me? I'll never know. All I know is I keep my door shut, and I never keep the blinds open. So, creepy nephew that had watched me for who knows how long. Let's not meet.